The vestry smelled faintly of furniture polish and damp wool, a combination familiar to anyone who had ever waited too long for a vicar to finish unrobing. The cassock had been hung with care, the surplice folded with less conviction. On the small oak table beneath the notice board lay a thin black notebook, its elastic strap unfastened, its pages slightly fanned as though it had been interrupted mid-thought. No one present wished to be the person who admitted they had found it. Mrs. Calder stood nearest, hands clasped around her handbag, which was large enough to suggest preparedness rather than extravagance. She had been churchwarden for 11 years and believed strongly in order, though she had never entirely trusted it. To her left, Mr. Henley, choir treasurer and self-appointed authority on what was appropriate, cleared his throat repeatedly, as if rehearsing a remark he did not intend to make. "It was just there," Mrs. Calder said at last, addressing the room rather than any individual within it. "On the table, I only noticed because I was putting the hymn-boards away." "And you opened it," Mr. Henley said, not accusingly.
"Merely observant." "I did not open it," she replied. "It was already open. Anyone could see that." This distinction mattered greatly to her. The vicar himself was not present. This absence was in its way the problem. Reverend Lionel Brooke
was late for tea with the Mothers' Union, late enough that people had begun to explain his lateness to one another in small, unsatisfactory ways. He was forgetful. He was overworked. He had been seen speaking to someone by the lich gate. Each explanation carried a different weight depending on who offered it. Inspector Purbright arrived 20 minutes later, having been summoned by a phone call that tried very hard not to sound like one. He removed his hat at the vestry door, not because anyone required it, but because the space encouraged small gestures of courtesy. His manner was mild, his expression attentive, without being inquisitive. "I'm told there's been a concern," he said. No one contradicted him. Mrs. Calder gestured towards the notebook, as though presenting an exhibit she would have preferred not to catalogue. "It belongs to the vicar." Purbright did not touch it. He looked at the table, the notice board behind it, flower rota, roof appeal, a fading poster advertising a harvest supper that had already occurred, and then at the faces around him. "And the concern?" he asked. Mr. Henley spoke first. "We can't find him." This was true, though incomplete. Purbright nodded. "Has he gone missing before?" "Not like this," Mrs. Calder said. "He always tells someone, even if it's only to say he's popping out." "And today?" "He said nothing at all." That too was true, though it rested on the assumption that silence had been deliberate. Purbright glanced again at the notebook. "May I?" Mrs. Calder hesitated, then inclined her head. Permission, once given, could not be withdrawn without embarrassment. He lifted the notebook carefully, noting its lightness. It was not the sort of book that carried confessions or grand revelations. Its pages were ruled, its handwriting neat, but compressed, as though space was something to be earned. He did not read aloud. He did not read much at all. A few lines were enough to understand why the vestry had grown so uncomfortable. "This isn't—" Mr. Henley began, then stopped. "It isn't what?" Purbright asked gently. "Well, it isn't what one expects." Mrs. Calder pressed her lips together. "There are names." Purbright looked up. "Names are not unusual." "No," she agreed. "But the way they're written is—" There was a pause in which everyone considered how much explanation was required. Outside, the church clock struck the quarter hour with a confidence the people inside did not share. Purbright closed the notebook and set it back exactly where it had been. "Who else has seen this?" "Only us," Mrs. Calder said. And Mrs. Linton briefly, but she thought it was the flower list and didn't.
Pay attention.
Mrs. Linton rarely does, Mr. Henley added, with a trace of relief. Purbright smiled faintly. And the Mothers' Union? They're waiting in the hall, Mrs. Calder said. We've put the kettle on again. Good, Purbright said. That will help. No one was certain how. He replaced his hat on his head, but did not leave at once. Until we know otherwise, he said. This is a matter of concern, not alarm. I suggest we keep it that way. Mrs. Calder exhaled, though she had not been aware of holding her breath. And the notebook? She asked. Purbright considered. For now, it stays where it is. People behave differently around objects they can see. This seemed plausible enough not to be questioned. As he stepped back into the nave, voices from the hall rose and fell, ordinary and reassuring. The church, in its stone patience, held everything without comment. In the vestry, the notebook lay quietly, saying nothing at all. Inspector Purbright crossed the churchyard slowly, not because there was distance to consider, but because people did not yet know whether they wished to speak to him. Gravel announced his steps well in advance. He noticed which faces turned and which did not, and how conversation altered its speed without changing its subject. By the lich gate, Mrs. Linton was arranging leaflets she had already arranged twice. She smiled with the effort of someone determined to be helpful before being asked. Purbright returned the smile and paused, allowing her the option of speech. Such a surprise, she said. Lionel is usually so particular. About time? Purbright asked. About everything, she replied, and immediately looked regretful. Not that I mean that unkindly. Of course not, she leaned closer. People are saying odd things. People usually do, Purbright said. Inside the parish hall, the Mothers' Union sat in disciplined unease, cups aligned, biscuits untouched. The kettle had boiled itself into submission. Mrs. Calder presided at the head of the table, her authority slightly undermined by the absence it was meant to organize. Purbright entered with the mild disruption of someone who had not been expected, but was not unwelcome. Chairs shifted, a space was made. We were just saying, began Mrs. Hargreaves, then stopped, uncertain who we now included. Purbright sat. Then please continue, she hesitated. Well, it's not like him.
That's what we were saying. This was accepted by the group as both accurate and sufficient. He wouldn't leave the book, said another voice.
He's very private, Mrs. Calder's lips tightened. He leaves things all the time, just not that. Purbright listened without note-taking. The rhythm of parish speech was not improved by interruption. He's been under strain, Mrs. Hargreaves added helpfully. All the talk about the roof, and the youth group. And the wedding, someone else said. That was awkward. Awkward how? Purbright asked. There was a collective pause while awkwardness was reviewed, for relevance. Eventually it was set aside. He seemed distracted, Mrs. Calder said. More than usual. Purbright thanked them and left before consensus could harden. Outside, Mr. Henley waited as though he had been doing so accidentally. You'll want to know about the notebook, he said. I've seen it. Yes, but you won't have understood it. Purbright regarded him. Then perhaps you'll explain. Mr. Henley lowered his voice. Those names, they're not pastoral visits. Why do you say that? Because some of them don't attend church, Purbright nodded, and yet they exist. That's not what I meant. No, Purbright agreed. They walked together towards the gate. Mr. Henley spoke of propriety, of expectations, of the dangers of misinterpretation, while simultaneously indulging in it. Purbright noted how often certainty borrowed the language of caution. At the gate, stood Mrs. Calder again, now joined by young Daniel Price, who rang the bells and absorbed adult tension without understanding its source. "I can stay if needed," Daniel offered. "Not yet," Purbright said kindly. "But thank you." As Daniel left, Mrs. Calder said, "People will assume the worst." "They always do," Purbright replied. "But this time they may feel justified." Purbright looked back at the church. Justification is a flexible thing. As he departed, the churchyard resumed its murmurs. Assumptions settled into place, large enough to be shared, small enough to be denied. Somewhere between them, the truth waited, unconsulted. Purbright did not hurry. The village rarely rewarded speed, and haste tended to invite confidence from the wrong people. He paused near the notice board by the green, where someone had pinned a handwritten appeal for a missing cat beneath an announcement for a jumble sale. Both notices assumed attention without offering proof of importance. He wondered which would be discussed more. At the post office window, Miss Avery lowered her voice before she had fully decided to speak. "If you're looking for him," she said, "he was here this morning." "At what time?" "Before 11. Bought stamps. 3 first class, 1 second. Very particular." "Did he seem troubled?" Miss Avery considered. "He seemed occupied." "That's not the same thing." Purbright agreed. Occupation often passed for distress when viewed from a distance. He thanked her and moved on, aware that the transaction would soon acquire additional detail in the retelling. Further along, outside the butcher's, Mr. Collins was recounting the situation with theatrical moderation. He broke off when he saw. Purbright then continued anyway, adjusting the emphasis. Names were not mentioned, but implication did the work efficiently. Purbright listened without interruption. When Mr. Collins finished, he said only, "You've thought about this." Someone
Has to, indeed.
By the time Purbright reached his car, the afternoon had arranged itself into a version of events that required no vicar at all. Concern had matured into interpretation. Interpretation was edging towards judgment. The notebook, unseen, had already done its work. Purbright sat for a moment before driving away. The village would continue without him, refining its assumptions with care. He suspected that when Reverend Brooke reappeared, he would find not relief, but explanation, waiting for him, neatly prepared. That, Purbright thought, was often when trouble truly began. He started the engine, already aware that absence, once noticed, acquired a personality of its own, persuasive and difficult to contradict. It would speak for the missing man until the man himself returned, if he returned at all. Silence, he reflected, was rarely neutral. Here, Purbright returned to the parish hall just as the Mothers' Union was rediscovering purpose through refreshment. The tea had been poured with renewed energy, cups refilled as though decisiveness could be achieved by volume. Conversation resumed in pairs and trios, lowering whenever he passed, then resuming with compensatory animation. He did not sit immediately, choosing instead to lean against the radiator, a position suggesting attendance without participation. Mrs. Calder noticed, and adjusted her tone accordingly, practical and faintly defensive. "We should be clear," she said, "that nothing improper has been established." This was received as both reassurance and challenge. Mrs. Hargreaves reached for a biscuit she had already declined twice. It broke cleanly, which seemed to encourage her. "I only meant," she said, "that Lionel has been correcting people lately." "Correcting them how?" Purbright asked. "Small things," Mrs. Hargreaves replied. "Dates, names, the way we remember events." There was nothing accusatory in her voice, but there was persistence. Purbright nodded as though this confirmed something he had already suspected, though he had not. "And the notebook?" someone asked. It was mentioned carefully, as one might mention weather, while referring to something else entirely. Purbright said only, "People write for many reasons." This satisfied no one, but it slowed the discussion. Outside the hall, rain had begun without ceremony, tapping insistently at the windows. Purbright stepped out briefly, encountering Mrs. Linton, hovering with purpose. "I thought you should know," she said. The vicar spoke to Miss Avery quite sharply. "About stamps?" Purbright asked. "No, about being mistaken," he corrected her publicly, which is not his way. "Correction again?" Purbright said mildly. Mrs. Linton nodded. It unsettled her. Inside, the Mothers' Union had reached the stage where certainty was being shared. Mrs. Calder was listing instances not to persuade but to organize. Purbright listened, intervening only to ask when. Timing altered emphasis, and emphasis altered meaning. By the time biscuits were finished, the vicar had acquired a temperament. Absent people often did. Purbright excused himself, promising nothing. At the door, he encountered Mr. Henley, who was waiting without admitting it. "You see it now," Mr. Henley said. He was keeping score. "Or notes," Purbright replied. They stood watching rain soften the church path, neither persuaded. Assumption had begun to behave like evidence, neat and portable. Purbright drove away again, thinking of the notebook not as a secret, but as a mirror. It reflected what people feared being seen to do themselves. The rain lingered into the evening, thinning rather than stopping, as though reluctant to leave its work unfinished. Purbright returned to the church not because he expected revelation, but because absence had begun to echo. The nave was empty now, chairs aligned with exaggerated obedience. Above, the choir loft waited, overlooked, yet alert, holding the memory of voices without offering them. Mrs. Calder had said the loft key was kept in the vestry drawer, a fact she delivered with quiet pride, as though proper storage were a moral achievement. Purbright found the drawer exactly where she had described it. The key lay on top, not hidden, not claimed. He noted this without interpretation. Objects often behaved better than people. The narrow stairs creaked with the modest complaint of wood doing what it had always done. At the top, the loft revealed itself as it always had. Hymnals stacked unevenly, a faint smell of dust and polish, a forgotten scarf draped over the back of a chair. Nothing suggested secrecy. That, Purbright thought, was usually when imagination began. He stood for a moment, looking down into the nave, considering how perspective altered intention. From above, the church felt exposed, almost domestic. He imagined conversations overheard, gestures misread, glances elevated into meaning by height alone. It was not difficult. Footsteps below announced company. Purbright descended to find Mrs. Hargreaves and Mr. Henley entering together, their proximity suggesting purpose rather than coincidence. They stopped when they saw him, then continued, unable to reverse, without embarrassment. "We didn't know you'd be here," Mrs. Hargreaves said. "I'm rarely announced," Purbright replied. Mr. Henley gestured upward. "People are saying things." "Yes," Purbright said, "they usually are." "The loft," Mr. Henley continued. "He's been up there more often." "Has he? Well, people have noticed." Purbright waited. Silence prompted elaboration. "He corrected the altos," Mrs. Hargreaves said, "very firmly." "About pitch?" "About words." They exchanged a look. Purbright understood the exchange, even if he did not yet share its conclusion. "You're assuming the notebook relates to this?" Purbright said. It explains it, Mr. Henley replied. Or it accommodates it, Purbright suggested. They bristled politely. Mrs. Hargreaves adjusted her cardigan. You make it sound innocent? I make it sound undecided. They left, soon after, satisfied they had contributed. Purbright remained, listening to the church settle around him. In the quiet, he noticed how easily space absorbed suspicion. The loft, the notebook, the silence between corrections. All required interpretation. All were being given one. As he locked the vestry, he found Daniel Price waiting outside, hands in pockets, eyes bright with the thrill of relevance. They say he was angry, Daniel said. The vicar. They say many things, Purbright replied. But I was there, Daniel insisted. He wasn't angry, he was worried. About what? Daniel hesitated. About getting it right. Purbright smiled faintly. Misunderstanding, he reflected, often began with agreement on the wrong premise. He thanked Daniel and watched him go, the boy already rehearsing how the conversation would sound when retold. Night settled over the church with practiced calm. Inside, nothing had changed. Outside, everything had. The choir loft had acquired a story. The notebook had acquired intent. Reverend Brooke's absence was now busy explaining itself. Purbright walked away, knowing that correction, once mistaken for judgment, rarely forgave the confusion. Mrs. Calder had always considered herself a reliable witness to ordinary life. She did not exaggerate, she did not embroider, and she took pride in remembering things as they were rather than as they later seemed. This confidence had served her well for years, and it was with that same assurance that she answered Inspector Purbright's knock the following morning. I don't want to make trouble, she said, ushering him into her sitting room, which smelled of toast and furniture polish. But I do think accuracy matters. Purbright agreed. He took the offered chair, noting the care with which it had been positioned, angled neither too close nor too far away. You said on the phone that you heard something, he said. Yes, or rather, I heard enough. She folded her hands. It was after evensong. I'd gone back to the vestry because I thought I'd left my scarf. And you hadn't, Purbright said. No, she said firmly. I had not. She described the moment carefully. The door not fully closed. Voices inside, one of them, unmistakably the vicar's. The other, she admitted, was less certain. I didn't mean to listen, she said. But when one hears one's own name, you heard your name? Yes, or at least I'm quite sure I did. Purbright nodded, encouraging detail without requesting it. He sounded upset, she continued. Not angry, upset, as though something had gone wrong. Did you hear what was said? Not precisely. Something about correcting a mistake, and someone not wanting it corrected. That could apply to many things. Mrs. Calder bristled. It did not sound trivial. Important things often do not, Purbright said gently. She hesitated, then added, I believe he said, if this is left as it is, people will misunderstand. Purbright let the words settle. And the other voice? I couldn't place it. It might have been a woman, or perhaps a younger man. Daniel Price? She shook her head. No, not Daniel. The kettle clicked off in the kitchen. Neither of them moved to attend it. Didn't mention this yesterday, Purbright said. I wasn't sure it mattered then, she replied. Now I'm not sure it doesn't. Outside, a car passed, too fast for the street. Mrs. Calder glanced towards the window, then back again. People are talking, she said, and they are talking inaccurately. Yes, Purbright said, they usually are. She looked at him sharply, uncertain whether she had been included. After he left, Purbright walked the long way back towards the green. The morning had brightened without enthusiasm. At the bench near the notice board, Mrs. Linton was already installed.
As though waiting for the day to begin. I expect you'll be wanting to know what I heard, she said. Purbright smiled. I expect you'll tell me regardless.
She described a different version of the same evening. Raised voices, sharp words, the vicar sounding uncharacteristically firm. No names, no phrases, only tone. It did not contradict Mrs. Calder's account so much as adjust its emphasis. People don't like being corrected, Mrs. Linton concluded. Some do, Purbright said. When they are correct. She laughed politely, then leaned closer. Do you think he's run off? Run off where? Anywhere, she said. Somewhere people don't know him. Purbright did not answer. He thanked her and moved on. Midday, the village had produced 3 versions of what Mrs. Calder had heard, none of which belonged to her. Each was plausible. Each borrowed confidence from repetition. Purbright listened without comment, noticing how often uncertainty was introduced with apology and ended with conviction. At the post office, Miss Avery corrected his change before he could. "I've been thinking," she said, "about Lionel." "Yes, T."
Hated mistakes, she said. But not because they were mistakes, because they became habits. Purbright considered this.
Habits are difficult to undo. Exactly. As he left, the church bells rang for noon, rung by Daniel Price with careful precision. The sound carried easily across the green, orderly and reassuring. Purbright paused, listening. Mrs. Calder's words returned to him, not as accusation, but as concern. If this is left as it is, people will misunderstand. He suspected that much already had. Inspector Purbright did not return to the vestry immediately. Instead, he allowed the morning to settle into its familiar patterns, knowing that routine often revealed more than inquiry. By early afternoon, the village had grown comfortable with its explanations, and comfort bred elaboration. It was only then that he went back to the church, where Mrs. Calder met him with a look suggesting readiness rather than relief. "I thought you might want another look," she said, already unlocking the vestry. "I might," Purbright agreed. The notebook lay where it had been left, though its stillness now felt deliberate, almost provocative. Mrs. Calder hovered, hands folded, watching his face rather than the object. "You don't think it's personal?" she asked. Purbright opened the notebook carefully. "That depends what one means by personal." He read more this time, though. Still not everything. Names, dates, brief annotations. Some entries were crossed through with decisive lines, others marked with small ticks. There were corrections in the margins, not angry, but precise. "These aren't confessions," Mrs. Calder said. "No," Purbright replied. "They're revisions." She frowned. "Of what?" "Of people," he said mildly. She did not like that. "That sounds intrusive." "It can be," he agreed. "It can also be conscientious." She watched as he turned another page. "You're
being very charitable. I'm being cautious." He pointed to a line she had not noticed. "This name, Mrs. Linton. And here, Miss Avery. And here, yourself." Mrs. Calder stiffened. "What does it say?" Purbright closed the book. "That."
"You corrected him?" Her indignation faltered. "About the rota," she said quickly. "He'd written the wrong date." "And he corrected the correction." She considered this, then sighed. "He does like things exact." "Yes," Purbright said. "But he also likes them fair." They were interrupted by a sound at the vestry door. Daniel Price stood there, breathless. "There's a letter," he said, "at the vicarage. It came this morning." Purbright followed him across the churchyard, Mrs. Calder trailing behind, resolute. The vicarage was quiet, its windows closed against the afternoon sun. On the hall table lay an envelope, already opened, addressed, in a familiar hand, Mrs. Calder. Read it first, then passed it to Purbright without comment. It was brief. An apology for absence, an explanation of necessity, a request that certain misunderstandings be delayed, if possible. He knew, Mrs. Calder said softly. He knew this would happen, Purbright nodded. He anticipated it. But why?
Leave the notebook? Purbright considered the question. Perhaps he didn't leave it, he said. Perhaps he forgot it. That seems careless. Carelessness is often just attention elsewhere. Mrs. Calder folded the letter neatly.
People will say he fled. They will, Purbright said, until he returns. And if he doesn't? Purbright looked around the familiar room, the carefully chosen furniture, the books aligned by size rather than subject. Then they'll say something else. Outside, voices drifted from the green. News was already moving. Back at the church, Mr. Henley was waiting, impatience disguised as concern. You've seen it now, he said. The letter? Yes. And, Purbright met his gaze. It explains absence, not guilt. Mr. Henley frowned. That's a distinction without difference. It often is, Purbright said, until it isn't. He left Mr. Henley standing by the gate, already rehearsing a revised version of events. As Purbright walked away, he thought again of the notebook. Not a diary, not a confession, a record of correction, of small errors addressed before they became habits. The village, he suspected, preferred the habits. By the third day of Reverend Brooke's absence, the village had discovered a new vocabulary for its concern. Words like pattern, precedent, and responsibility appeared with increasing confidence, often in sentences that had begun with, "I'm not saying
anything but."
Inspector Purbright listened to these with the patience of someone accustomed to hearing conclusions before reasons. He spent the morning examining the parish rota, which had been pinned to the notice board with unusual firmness. Mrs. Calder supervised, from a careful distance, keen to be useful without appearing implicated. Names were arranged in tidy columns, readings, flowers, cleaning, tea. Respectability, Purbright thought, was often administered in weekly shifts. You'll notice, Mrs. Calder said, that Lionel was very particular about balance. Balance? Purbright asked, not letting anyone do too much. Or too little? Purbright traced a finger down the list. Certain names appeared regularly, others rarely. This was not accidental. Villages, like orchestras, preferred familiar players in visible roles. He did make changes, Mrs. Calder added. Quiet ones, such as removing people without
explanation. Without announcement, she corrected. Which is different. Purbright agreed that it was. Silence preserved dignity while allowing interpretation.
It was an effective method. Later, at the butcher's, Mr. Collins was holding court with a precision usually reserved for scales. You look at the rota, he said, lowering his voice for effect, and you see who's trusted. Purbright waited until he was noticed. And who decides that? Mr. Collins hesitated. Well, the vicar, obviously. And now, Mr. Collins smiled, not unkindly. Now we notice. At the vicarage, Mrs. Calder and Mr. Henley were engaged in what they called keeping things going. This involved rearranging papers and making lists of what might need rearranging. Next, Purbright observed quietly, noting how often order replaced authority when authority was absent. People expect continuity, Mr. Henley said, especially in a place like this. Do they? Purbright asked. They expect things to look the same. Purbright glanced at the mantelpiece where photographs had been moved an inch to the left. Looking the same, he said, is not always the same as being the same. Mr. Henley did not respond, choosing instead to straighten a pile that had not moved. That afternoon, Purbright spoke with Mrs. Hargreaves, who had recently been removed from the flower rota without explanation. She accepted the tea but declined the sympathy. "I don't mind," she said. "It's probably for the best." "For whom?" Purbright asked. She considered. "For everyone." This was said with conviction, though it explained nothing. "You'd think it was a judgment," Purbright said. "I think it was a correction," she replied. "And corrections always feel like judgments when they're about you." At the post office, Miss Avery was less forgiving. "He crossed my name out," she said. "No discussion." "Did you ask him why?" "No," she said. "I assumed." Purbright nodded. Assumption, he was learning, was the village's most renewable resource. By evening, a meeting had been suggested, not organized, merely anticipated. People spoke of it as though it already existed. Purbright attended without invitation, finding a seat at the back where he could watch respectability being negotiated in real time. Mrs. Calder spoke first, calm and procedural. Mr. Henley followed, invoking tradition with careful emphasis. Others contributed anecdotes, each framed as concern, each nudging the same conclusion. Purbright did not speak until the end. When he did, it was to ask a single question. "If Reverend Brooke were here," he said, "what would you say to him?" There was a pause. Answers formed and dissolved. "That," Purbright said gently, "is often why people write things down." The meeting ended without resolution, which satisfied most. Outside, the rota remained pinned, immaculate and misleading. Respectability had been preserved, though at some cost. As Purbright left, he thought again of the notebook. It had not accused, it had not condemned, it had merely recorded who was where and whether that placement was deserved. The village, he suspected, preferred not to know. By the fourth morning, the village had learned how to repeat itself without sounding repetitive. Inspector Purbright noticed this first at the post office, where Miss Avery offered the same concern she had voiced the day before, altered only by emphasis. Reverend Brooke's absence was now described as unfortunate rather than odd, a word that suggested sympathy without surrendering suspicion. Purbright collected these refinements quietly. Polite repetition, he reflected, was how uncertainty trained itself to appear reasonable. When people corrected their language, they rarely corrected their assumptions. He left with stamps he did not need and a sense that the village was practicing its explanation, smoothing the edges in anticipation of resistance. At the church, Mrs. Calder was rearranging the notice board again. The missing cat had been replaced by a reminder about proper parking for Sunday services. Order, she believed, must be visible. "People are calming down," she said, adjusting a pin. "They're starting to understand the situation." Purbright asked what situation that might be. She hesitated, then replied, "That Lionel is particular, and that particular people sometimes misjudge how they're perceived." This seemed to satisfy her. It was explanation without accusation, correction without apology. Purbright nodded, aware that such phrasing travelled well. It allowed repetition without responsibility. He encountered Mr. Henley near the vestry, engaged in conversation with Mr. Collins. They fell silent, then resumed with exaggerated normality. "We've been saying," Mr. Collins offered, "that mistakes happen and that sometimes they're repeated." Purbright asked whose mistakes these were. Mr. Collins smiled faintly. "No one's in particular, that's the trouble." Mr. Henley added that correction, when done too often, became its own error. This was said with the confidence of something already agreed upon elsewhere. Purbright listened, noting how easily judgment borrowed the language of balance. That afternoon, Mrs. Hargreaves stopped Purbright by the green. She had been thinking, she said, about the flower rota. "I may have been careless," she admitted. "I reused arrangements. Lionel didn't like that." Purbright asked if she thought that justified removal. She considered. "Justified isn't the word, but I understand it now." Understanding, he noted, often arrived after the conclusion. She seemed relieved to have corrected herself, even if the correction changed nothing. Repetition, when polite, could feel like progress. At the vicarage, the letter still lay on the hall table, moved but not put away. Mrs. Calder read it again aloud, as though familiarity might alter its meaning. The apology sounded gentler each time. "He says misunderstandings should be delayed," she said, as though that were possible. Purbright suggested misunderstandings were rarely delayed, only managed. She smiled thinly. "That sounds like something Lionel would say." The repetition pleased her. It made absence feel inhabited. That evening, Purbright walked the perimeter of the green, listening to fragments of conversation drifting from open windows. The same phrases appeared, adjusted slightly, corrected politely. Particular, misunderstood, well-intentioned. Each repetition added confidence, not clarity. He thought again of the notebook, its neat revisions, its refusal to dramatize. The village, by contrast, was revising aloud, correcting tone rather than content. He suspected that an error, repeated politely often enough, became tradition as dusk settled, the church bells rang again, steady and precise. Daniel Price rang them with care, correcting a minor slip before it became audible. Purbright listened, considering how correction worked best when unseen. The village preferred its errors familiar, its corrections gentle, its explanations rehearsed. Somewhere within that comfort lay the truth, unchanged by repetition. He suspected it would not announce itself. It rarely did. By the 5th day, the village had reached agreement. Inspector Purbright recognized the moment not by announcement, but by ease. Conversations no longer paused when he approached. Instead, they adjusted, as though confident enough to withstand scrutiny. Agreement, he knew, rarely meant truth. It meant convenience. The thing everyone agreed on was simple enough to repeat. Reverend Brooke had meant well. He had been exacting, perhaps too exacting. In a small place, exactness could feel like judgment. Absence, therefore, was not surprising. Regrettable, certainly, but understandable. The explanation had the virtue of requiring no further effort. Purbright heard it expressed with slight variations, each speaker convinced they were adding nuance rather than reinforcement. At the post office, Miss Avery said, "He didn't realize how it sounded." Outside the butcher's, Mr. Collins offered, "You can't go correcting everyone all the time." In the parish hall, Mrs. Hargreaves concluded he probably needed a rest. Each remark carried relief. Agreement allowed people to stand together without looking too closely at where they stood. Purbright spent the morning walking, listening, resisting the urge to interrupt. He noticed how often people referred to we. We understand. We don't. Blame him. We hope he's all right. The collective pronoun did a great deal of work. It smoothed differences, absorbed responsibility, and ensured no one stood alone with their doubts. At the church, Mrs. Calder was polishing the brass, a task she had postponed until certainty returned. "People are being very fair," she said, pausing to admire her work. "No one's rushing to judgment." Purbright asked what judgment that might be. She smiled faintly. "Well, any judgment." The brass gleamed, reflecting a version of the church that suggested care. without conflict. "You seem satisfied," Purbright said. "I'm relieved," she replied. "It's unpleasant, all this uncertainty." "Yes," he said, "it is." She hesitated, then added, "Of course, if he'd just explained—" "If he'd been here," Purbright said. She nodded. "That too." Later, Purbright encountered Daniel Price near the bell tower. The boy was coiling rope with unnecessary diligence. "They've decided," Daniel said, without being asked. "Decided what?" "That he didn't mean it," Daniel replied. "Whatever it was," Purbright smiled. "And do you agree?" Daniel shrugged. "I think he was worried." "About what?" "About everyone agreeing on the wrong thing." Purbright said nothing. Agreement, once achieved, was difficult to unsettle, especially when it offered comfort. He thanked Daniel and continued on, aware that the boy's remark would not travel. It lacked usefulness. By midday, a notice had appeared on the board. Temporary. Arrangements in place until further notice. It was unsigned. Purbright read it twice. Temporary, he thought, was a word people used when they did not wish to imagine permanence. Further notice implied someone would be around to give it. He returned. To the vestry alone, the notebook remained, now regarded less as evidence than artifact. He opened it again, slowly, resisting the impulse to search for revelation. The entries had not changed. Names, dates, brief notes, corrections made, corrections reconsidered. One page caught his attention, not for what it said, but for what it did not. Several names were listed without annotation. No ticks, no lines through, just names. Purbright closed the book. The thing everyone agreed on was that the notebook was judgmental. It was easier than admitting it might be incomplete. As afternoony faded, the village settled into its version of resolution. Tea was poured, plans were made, the rota was amended with careful diplomacy. Respectability resumed its place, slightly rearranged but intact. Purbright observed without comment, aware that agreement often felt like an ending. It was rarely one. That evening, as he prepared to leave, he received a message. Brief. Precise. It did not explain, but it corrected something. Purbright read it once, then again. The agreement the village had reached would not survive it. He folded the paper carefully and put it away. The thing everyone agreed on, he reflected, had been wrong. The message Purbright received was not dramatic. It did not announce itself as revelation. It corrected a time. That was all. A meeting that had not happened when the village believed it had. A conversation remembered out of sequence. The sort of thing most people adjusted without comment. Purbright, however, adjusted everything else around it. He returned to the village early, before certainty had fully reasserted itself. Morning, routines were already in motion, protective in their familiarity. People greeted him with the confidence of those who believed matters settled. Resolution, even a false one, was comforting. It allowed people to move without hesitation. At the post office, Miss Avery handed him his change and said, "I hope it's all coming right." She meant it kindly. Purbright asked what right now meant. She smiled. Well, as right as it can be. That, he thought, was the phrase people used when accuracy felt intrusive. He walked next to the vicarage, where the windows were still shut, the door unoccupied by notice or explanation. Mrs. Calder arrived shortly after, keys ready, her manner brisk. "I thought I'd air the place," she said. "It doesn't do to let things feel abandoned." She said abandoned carefully, as though correcting herself mid-thought. Inside, Purbright showed her the message. She read it twice, frowning.
"That can't be right," she said. "I remember it clearly."
"You remember it as it has been repeated," Purbright said. "Not as it occurred," she bristled. "I don't invent things." "No," he agreed. "You arrange them." They sat in the quiet sitting room, the furniture attentive. Mrs. Calder's discomfort was not defensive so much as wounded. "If I was mistaken," she said, "it wasn't intentional." "Of course not. But people will think—" "They will think you protected yourself," Purbright said gently. "As everyone does." She was silent. Protection, he knew, was rarely malicious. It was often an instinctive correction, a smoothing of memory, that allowed one to remain consistent. Later, he spoke with Mr. Henley, who reacted with irritation rather than denial. "This changes nothing," he said. "The effect is the same." Purbright asked whether effect should outrank cause. Mr. Henley replied that in a small place they usually did. "People have to go on living together," he said. "You can't—"
"Keep reopening things, unless they were never closed," Purbright said. Mr. Henley folded his arms.
"You're suggesting people lied." "I'm suggesting they adjusted," Purbright replied. Politely. That afternoon, Purbright gathered several of them in the parish hall. Not a meeting exactly, more a convergence. He did not accuse. He asked questions that required people to explain their certainty. When had they first believed the vicar angry? Who had said it aloud? When had it become agreed upon? Answers shifted. Timelines softened. Each person remembered differently, yet all remembered agreement. Mrs. Hargreaves realized she had repeated what Mrs. Linton had suggested. Mrs. Linton realized she had inferred tone from silence. Miss Avery admitted she had corrected herself mid-retelling to sound fairer. No one felt exposed. That was the problem. Each adjustment had felt reasonable at the time. Purbright did not mention the notebook. He did not need to. The pattern had emerged without it. People protected themselves from uncertainty by sharing it, then sanding down its edges until it resembled fact. "So what really happened?" Mrs. Calder asked at last. Purbright answered carefully. "A man noticed small errors. He corrected them. Some people felt judged, others felt relieved. When he left unexpectedly, the village corrected the absence to protect itself from embarrassment." "And the notebook?" "Was an attempt to keep things accurate," Purbright said. "Not to condemn." There was a pause. Someone laughed softly, not in humor, but recognition. "He was trying to help," Daniel Price said from the doorway. "No one had noticed him arrive." "Yes," Purbright said, "and people were trying not to feel helped." As the group dispersed, the village did not feel resolved. It felt adjusted again, though this time less comfortably. Explanations would need reworking. Some repetitions would be abandoned. Others would persist. That evening, Purbright walked alone by the church. Protection, he reflected, was not the same as deception. It was quieter, kinder, more dangerous. People corrected themselves into belief, then defended the belief as though it had always been theirs. He knew Reverend Brooke would return soon. The message had suggested as much. When he did, he would not be met with apology or accusation, but with careful normality. That was how villages protected themselves from correction. Purbright looked at the church door, closed but unlocked. Accuracy, he thought, was rarely welcomed at first. It required rearrangement. And rearrangement, however necessary, always felt like loss to those who had grown comfortable with where things stood. Reverend Brooke returned on a Thursday afternoon, which felt deliberate, even if it was not. The village was accustomed to Thursdays, being neither beginnings nor endings, and his arrival carried the same quality. He walked up the path to the vicarage without haste, a small case in one hand, his coat buttoned despite the mildness of the day. Several people saw him. No one approached. Arrival, like absence, required adjustment. Inspector Purbright was waiting in the sitting room, seated where Mrs. Calder usually placed visitors she intended to manage. Reverend Brooke greeted him with relief that did not attempt disguise. "I was told you'd be here," he said. That seemed sensible. Purbright stood. They shook hands without ceremony. "I didn't intend disruption," the vicar said, as though continuing a conversation rather than beginning one. "I know," Purbright replied. They sat. For a moment neither spoke. Outside, the village continued, its sounds careful, as though listening. "I left the notebook," Reverend Brooke said at last. "That was careless?" "Perhaps," Purbright said. "Or perhaps it was timely," Wheatheat's vicar smiled faintly. "It appears to have been interpreted." "Yes. That was what I hoped to avoid." Purbright did not contradict him. Reverend Brooke explained, not defensively but precisely. He had gone to consult a colleague, someone who remembered a similar parish dispute years earlier. He had taken the notebook with him, then returned in haste, forgetting it on the vestry table. "I keep notes," he said, "not of sins, of habits, of where small things go wrong." "And people assumed they were being judged," Purbright said. "They usually do," the vicar replied. "Correction is rarely welcome when it is accurate." Later that afternoon, Mrs. Calder arrived with a basket of paperwork and the expression of someone prepared to be gracious. She greeted the vicar warmly, then paused, uncertain how much warmth was now appropriate. "I'm glad you're back," she said. "So am I," he replied. She mentioned the rota, the temporary arrangements, the meeting that had not quite been a meeting. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he said, "I think some things might be reassigned." The word settled between them. Reassigned, not restored. Adjusted, not corrected. "Yes," Mrs. Calder said quickly. "Of course." By evening, the village knew he had returned. Knowledge travelled more quickly than welcome. People prepared expressions of relief that contained caution, apologies that avoided ownership. Reverend Brooke accepted them all with mild attention, offering nothing that required response. On Sunday, the church was full. Attendance suggested solidarity rather than devotion. Reverend Brooke conducted the service with his usual restraint, making no reference to absence or misunderstanding. His sermon concerned stewardship, not of money, but of memory. People listened politely, correcting their posture when they realized they had stopped. Afterwards, in the hall, tea was poured. Conversations resumed with careful cheer. The notebook was not mentioned. The absence was referred to obliquely as a rest or break. Reverend Brooke did not contradict this. Correction, he knew, required timing. Inspector Purbright observed from the edge of the room. Mrs. Calder approached him last. "It seems to have settled," she said. "For now," Purbright replied. "He's reassigned some duties," she added. Quietly. "Yes. That should help." Purbright smiled. "It usually does." As the afternoon thinned, people drifted away, carrying with them a revised understanding that required minimal effort to maintain. Reverend Brooke stood by the door, thanking each with equal attention. When Daniel Price passed, he paused. "You rang well," the vicar said. Daniel
nodded, pleased.
"I corrected a slip." "I know," Reverend Brooke said. "I heard." When the hall was empty, Reverend Brooke returned to the vestry. The table was bare. The notebook had been placed in a drawer, not hidden, merely put away. He opened it, briefly, then closed it again, satisfied. Purbright joined him at the door. "You'll find," the inspector said, "that people prefer reassignment to correction." "Yes," the vicar replied. "It allows them to believe they've chosen. They stood together for a moment, listening to the church settle. Outside, the village resumed its patterns, slightly altered, largely intact. Purbright put on his hat. "It will be spoken of," he said, "but differently." "That's acceptable," Reverend Brooks said. "Accuracy is not always required." "Only occasionally," Purbright agreed. He left as evening drew in, the church behind him calm and unremarkable. Inside, the notebook remained, quiet again, its work unfinished but sufficient. The village would continue, correcting itself as needed politely, repeatedly. And somewhere within that repetition truth would rest, patient, waiting for the moment it was invited rather than assumed.